Mr. Chertoff, thank you very much for this interview. I understand you developed the playbook for a pandemic back in 2007 when you suspected something was coming, and then in 2009, it was H1N1. What was that process? What did you do then?
Well, it was my department, Homeland Security, as well as Health and Human Services. And in the first decade of the 2000s, we were concerned about avian flu because there had been some outbreaks of avian flu and swine flu. And we were concerned about a bioterrorism event. So for all these reasons, we put together a plan that included biosurveillance, a stockpile, and a series of duties or tasks you would execute if there was in fact a pandemic or a biological attack as a way of addressing the issue and mitigating the risk.
Mm-hmm. And why didn't they use the same thing, the same playbook this time with coronavirus?
Well, I can't really answer that. I mean, obviously a lot of time has passed. I think, to be honest, over time, people forget or they get complacent or they become involved with other things. And I can't explain why it wasn't used in full. There are some people who were around back in 2007, like Tony Fauci. He does understand how it works. But I think perhaps what happened is people began to assume we'd never have a problem because it didn't happen for 20 years.
Do you think they're managing the thing well?
I think that the government, in fact, many governments have been slow to respond. And I understand it's very difficult because the early course of the pandemic is not clear. There were some real issues about how contagious it was, to what extent symptoms are necessary to become contagious or whether you can become asymptomatically contagious. And I think all that slowed up the process. I think some of the states in the US have moved quite energetically, California and New York. Others have frankly lagged and been slow. And the hope is now that we've had some time, people are being more deliberate and more careful about the decisions they make going forward.
Back in your time in office, all these swine flus and all the flus you're talking about, most of them came from Asia, from China. And then I understand you struggled with China in terms of sharing information and all that. How do you see China 10 years later? How do you think China behaved this time in terms of the pandemic?
Well, I think there's a serious concern that the Chinese were not forthcoming or transparent about the pandemic when it first began, and also about how they were able to respond to it. They were trying to make it seem like there was no problem. There's a political dimension to that. And as a consequence, they were slow in sharing information and giving access. And that's really a shame, because whatever our political differences with China, when you're facing a pandemic or a global outbreak, everybody is in the same boat. And nobody can be safe if one part of the world is not safe. So it's a shame that the Chinese were not more forthcoming. And I think one of the lessons learned going forward is whatever our differences on trade or national security, we ought to identify those global challenges that require unity of effort internationally.
Mm-hmm. And do you think China has outrun the United States as that superpower, that world superpower?
No, I think what China has taken advantage of is that the U.S. in the last couple of years has stepped back from some of its global leadership role. The idea of America first has become translated into America only. We've not been as close to some of our allies as we had been in the past. And so the Chinese are trying to step in to exploit that. But frankly, much of what they do is using disinformation and propaganda as a way of making it seem that they are doing better than they really are. They also use their economic power as a way of leveraging their geopolitical influence. And again, we in the democratic West have been slow to match that because obviously it does cost money and effort. And that means if we don't match it, the Chinese will fill the vacuum.
What do you think? How's Mexico handling the situation?
Well, I think, again, with the pandemic, Mexico, I think, didn't have the same impact as early as we did. Although I think now Mexico is stepping up to do the kinds of things they need to do, again, in order to minimize social contact. I have to say, I was actually in Mexico, in Acapulco, at a bankers conference at the end of February. And at that point, there still was very little manifestation of the pandemic in Mexico. In fact, I had been concerned whether I'd be allowed to travel, and there was no problem. But it turned out a week or so after I came back, in fact, the pandemic hit and the travel restrictions were put in place.
Mm-hmm. What is the impact of having the border closed between Mexico and the United States?
Well, it has a very serious impact because we do have supply chains that cross the border, and they've increased over the years. And one of the things when we did our plan many years ago is we recognized that there is a big economic and even a health cost if you totally lock down the border. That doesn't mean you don't make changes in how you screen people or who you allow to cross, but it does mean a blanket closure, if it's sustained over a period of time, actually can make matters worse.
Mm-hmm. And do you think they reopen together in a coordinated way? Because there has been some pressure from the United States. Mexico running a little bit behind, a few weeks behind. So some industries from the United States are putting pressure on Mexican industries to open up as well at the same time, even though Mexico is not ready for opening.
Well, and that's why I say earlier, this is a kind of issue that requires international cooperation. There are going to be differences in the impact in different countries. And that means people, particularly neighbors, have to coordinate. So we have to figure out how do we work with Mexico to get Mexico in a condition to reopen as quickly as possible, recognizing that the Mexican government has its primary obligation to its own citizens, as the U.S. government does to American citizens.
How do you think is Donald Trump's administration handling the U.S.-Mexico relationship?
I think that the administration here has unnecessarily sometimes created a hostile message about Mexico and Mexicans, although I think ironically, in many ways, as it relates to dealing with cross-border issues involving migration from South America, there's been actually a fair bit of cooperation between the Mexican government and the U.S. government. And it would not necessarily have been obvious that would happen when Trump was elected and when Lopez Obrador was elected. But again, sometimes necessity forces cooperation, and it's much better to be working cooperatively on these efforts than to be hurling insults back and forth.
You think Mexico is going to be again the punching bag of the next election or the current election that is going on in the United States?
I don't know that Mexico per se will be. I do think immigration is a political issue, along with some others. And this administration has fostered that as a political issue to get its supporters very excited. On the other hand, certainly the coronavirus is an overwhelming fact that kind of obscures everything else. I hope that we don't make this again an election about trying to scare people about, people are, flooding in from other countries, but rather how do we deal practically with what is the biggest global challenge since the Second World War, economically and from a health standpoint.
Back when you were in office, Mr. Chertoff, what was the main thing that worried you about Mexico? Was it drug cartels? Was it corruption in the high levels of the Mexican government? What was your main worry about Mexico?
I think our concern, and we had a very good relationship with the Mexican government, but our concern was the power of the cartels and the fact that there were certain areas in Mexico where the control of communities was really in the hands of criminals. The local authorities didn't really have any power. And I remember I had a conversation with President Calderon when he first came into office. And we both agreed that the government had to take the steps necessary to make sure that the rule of law extended even into those areas that had been dominated by the cartels, which had and have a lot of money and a lot of weapons, and were able to dominate certain communities.
And at a certain point, did you fear, Mr. Chertoff, that whether the president or any of his ministers were colluded with the drug traffickers, the drug cartels?
When I was in office, I don't remember there being any evidence of collusion. I understand that there have been cases in the past where there have been government officials who have been charged with things. And I understand there's some allegations about Mr. Garcia Luna that have emerged more recently, but that occurred after my time in office.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think the situation has evolved with the drug cartels?
Well, unfortunately, transnational criminal organizations continue to be powerful, not just in Mexico, but in the Western Hemisphere and in other parts of the globe. And part of the problem is they have a lot of money, they have a lot of power. Where you have weak governance or a weak rule of law, they step in. And I think particularly if you look at Central America and the Northern Triangle, one of the reasons we see people fleeing to go north is because they are living in an environment where they don't feel they have rule of law and protection against criminals. And so to me, in many ways, transnational crime is similar to terrorism. It is an international problem we have to deal with internationally, and it is a national security threat.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that can evolve to a terrorism threat from Mexico?
Well, I mean, I can't necessarily say from Mexico, but what we've seen, for example, in the past in Colombia, the FARC, which was a political organization engaged in terrorism, ultimately got into the drug business. And when I was at the Department of Justice, we indicted them for drug trafficking because from their standpoint, drug business was money they could use to finance their terrorist and revolutionary activities. So we have seen terrorist groups and we've seen organized crime groups make common cause. I think you see some of that in Venezuela right now, and that's something we need to be concerned about.
Talking about privacy, which was a big issue when the war on terror started, what do you think about reopening the economy? Some experts have said, well, you need a lot of tests and you need to have at least a vaccine or a treatment, but then also you need to kind of give up a little privacy in order for the government to track through web apps and phone apps the whereabouts of the citizens whenever they're infected, etc. Do you think we should give up a little privacy in order to be back to normal, or whatever normal is going to be?
Well, I think that the key is what do we mean by a little? I can understand, and I see the value in having a certain amount of contact tracing and warning, so people know if they've been in touch with someone who's been infected and they know to take steps to quarantine themselves. And it may be worth it to have a certain amount of tracking and information collection in order to protect people's lives. But if we're going to do that, we need to be very clear about who gets to use the information, what it's used for, how long it's retained, and in what circumstances it can be actually connected to a name as opposed to kept anonymously. I think that this is a matter, again, it requires a deliberate, disciplined approach. I think it's a mistake to say we're not going to do any tracking and tracing because we're going to give up an important tool in protecting ourselves. But that doesn't mean that once you start that process, you can use it for whatever reason. And just like in the counterterrorism area, we've ultimately moved to the point where the data we collect is important, but we don't collect or misuse it in a way that goes beyond what the core mission is.
Mm-hmm. Two final things, Mr. If I'm allowed. First one, now you were saying about President Calderon, and I guess you were in office whenever this very complicated election Mexico took place between actually López Obrador and President Trump. What recollection do you have of that? It was quite a turmoil back then.
Well, we were not directly involved. So, I mean, I only knew what the newspapers reported. And obviously, our main concern was to have an outcome that was stable and accepted. And the good news is, Mexico remains a democracy. We've always had a very good cooperative relationship with them on the national security and law enforcement front. And so, we just wished that the will of the people ultimately be established and that then the government go about the business of, again, improving the economy and the rule of law.
What do you think about President López Obrador?
Well, I mean, I think he's been energetic. He's actually, I think, done some smart things in terms of his popularity, reducing the pomp and circumstance. He has been cooperative with the U.S. in certain respects. So to the extent that he's turned out to be somewhat more pragmatic than maybe people feared based on the rhetoric, I think that's a good thing. And, look, as with any democracy, ours, yours, Canada, we might not always agree on every political issue, but the point is, certainly those of us in North America have a common interest. We face some common challenges, and if we can put differences aside, we can actually work to make life better for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what's your forecast for November the 3rd, if I may?
It's going to be a Tuesday. That's about all I can say.
You wouldn't put money on it?
The things are so up in the air right now. If there's any lesson that we should have learned over the last few years, is anybody who makes a prediction, it's the political version of the weather report. It usually only turns out to be good the day they actually issue the report.
So at the end, it's going to be coronavirus, the name of the game on the election. Whatever happens with the coronavirus is going to be the factor on the election?
I think it'll be, yes, not the only factor, but the major factor, because it also has a great impact on the economy. Right now, the economy, which was doing well a year ago, is now doing very poorly. So where that is, where the virus is, and then heaven knows what else goes on, it's very difficult to predict. One thing we are very focused on, and I've been involved in personally, is making sure that people can vote, that we have alternative ways of voting by mail, so that people don't have to put themselves at risk or simply skip going to the polls. And we're also monitoring very carefully what countries like Russia and China may try to do with disinformation to manipulate or interfere with our election by spreading false information. And I believe actually the Russians have done some of this in Mexico as well. Use disinformation to try to create social disruption. So that is a concern that a lot of us are looking at going into November.
We'll see then. Thank you very much, Mr. Chertoff.
Thank you, Carlos. Stay safe.
Stay safe. It was amazing talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.